Hello, and welcome to the Dissident Mama podcast. Today, my guest is T.L. Hulsey. Hulsey is a retired computer programmer living in Mexico. He is the author of about a dozen books on subjects including political science, biography, translation, drama, and fiction. Hulsey attended for 2 years each the Catholic institutions of the University of Dallas in Texas and Fordham University in New York, majoring in economics and philosophy. However, he holds no degree. Hulsey blogs occasionally at LouRockwell.com, but more recently at the Abbeville Institute. His latest work, The Constitution of NonState Government, Field Guide to Texas Secession, published in November 2022 by Shotwell Publishing, has received praise from scholars including Drs. David Gordon, Clyde Wilson, Donald Livingston, Walter Block, and David R. Upham. And that is the book that we're going to be focusing on talking about today. So welcome, Terry.
Thanks for having me, Rebecca.
Yeah, so this is our second whirl at this. We had some tech issues the other day, so I'm going to get right into the meat and potatoes. So you are quite the scholar. Anybody who picks up this book will see that, and it's more impressive that you're self-taught. And this book is a very serious book, and it's not for the slothful, but it's extremely well organized and not even 300 pages. So we're going to get into some deep topics because talking about governance and freedom and human flourishing, that's deep stuff. But it's a book that I think everybody should buy. And last time I had the book in here and I was going to hold it up, but this time I don't. So anyway, it's sold on Amazon. Yeah, hold it up. There we go. Excellent. Thank you. So you can go to Shotwell Publishing and access it, or just go straight to Amazon. So the first half of the book is a summary of how we kind of got to where we're at, we as in America. It's some social contract theory, history, and philosophy, what you call apodictic foundation. And then the second half is how non-state government could be actualized in reality, pragmatically the track to independence, what you call instantiation. That's the how-to guide part of it. And I think that's what's so impressive. It's not just theory. A lot of people have theory. You actually tell people how this transition to a non-state republic could unfold. So let's start talking about, first of all, why did you write this book and what are you trying to accomplish by it?
The reason I wrote the book is that America is in a bad way. It's in a bad way because it has embraced the state form of government, and there's no remedy for its ills. I contend, following Luigi Bassani, the strict definition of the state, inaugurating with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which concluded the 30 Years' War in Europe. And with that inauguration, the state acquired characteristics that inevitably drove it to the totalitarian position that it's in today. So I may as well give the definition of the state. Bassani rejects Max Weber's traditional and familiar definition of the state as being that legitimate monopoly of force over a given terrain. So he says that it's circular in that the legitimacy is given by the monopoly of force itself. Its real claim to legitimacy is established by that monopoly of force. So what I think is a clearer definition of the state is that it's a form of government relentlessly striving to remove every mediating institution between its power and its subject citizen, seeking legitimacy through majoritarian absolutism and the delusion of enumerated guarantees, so-called rights, against all encroachment, even its own. So I think that really encapsulates the problems with the current position of the state, which, again, to enforce the distinction, is not the same thing as government. Government is that state of affairs that has always been with us, that arises when there's more than one person trying to achieve goals that are necessary for human existence. So with this definition of the state, we see that I think it's, just to go back to where I got this, I think it was inspired mostly by my reading of the Russian mathematician Igor Shafarovich, who just wrote a fabulous book, had nothing to do with mathematics, about socialism. So his definition of socialism is that it does exactly that. Socialism tries to remove all of these mediating institutions between the government and the individual. That is, it is at war constantly against property, against family, against religion, and against the individual. So this inevitable striving to remove these associations are apparent in our current history. For example, there you no longer have a right of association if you wanted to, for example, build a golf course that excluded Blacks and Jews for some reason that I would not agree with. You would be prevented from doing that by the government. But on a more familiar and practical level, if you wanted to, for example, open up a cake shop and you did not want to create cakes that had obscene pictures or demonic representations on top of the cake, you, as we see in current rulings by the Supreme Court, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. So those who have been scrutinized on narrow grounds that doesn't exclude the possibility that the government can step in and impose its will for those associations. Also, too, we see the government interposing itself in decisions that are rightly those of the family. So if you want to, for example, there's always been, or in the past several decades, this discussion of having vouchers for private schooling. So the government says, no, we want to make sure that there are universal values that apply to all schooling, and you cannot use government funds for these private purposes. So that's a very critical example, because it's the family, your children, by which you project your values into the future. And now the state is saying that we will impose enormous costs on you. You must pay taxes for public schools and go to private school if you insist on that. But we will in no case help you with your God-given right or your natural right to instruct your children in the spiritual values that are important to you. And even it's currently devolved into the interposition of the government with your own personal identity. So, for example, it has been since time immemorial the accepted common sense truth that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. But now the government can step in and say, if there is even one person who contests that, we as the government can impose our definition of what gender and sexuality mean, to the detriment of everyone else who has the common sense view. So this is just, these are the common interpositions of the state between its power and the individual. It seeks to remove all of those mediating institutions and impose its will absolutely on each individual citizen. And one last point, this has been recognized in legally constitutionally with the 1958 ruling Cooper versus Aaron, which states that states' right, in effect, no longer exists, that the national government has a right to impose its values, to overrule in areas which were normally left between the state and the state's citizens. So we see that this inevitable trend for removing these intermediating institutions, and it began, I don't know if we want to go down the trail of history, but it began with the discussion of sovereignty in the middle of the, well, actually in the 17th century. So should we go down that trail? I'd be glad to.
Yeah.
Okay. So the 30 Years' War, as we said, was concluded with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And that historical moment is, you have to realize what was happening then. During this war, it eventually became a religious war between Protestants and Catholics. And it was extremely devastating, especially to Northern Europe and Germany. In the Palatinate, that is along the Rhine River in Western Germany, about a third of the citizens perished in these wars. And you can look at these prints by Albrecht Dürer showing this terrible sufferings of people who were made non-human by their enemies. And there were atrocities on both sides. And here's the thing, that what happens in a religious war is that one side or both sides declares the opposite, evil. And once you say that a person is evil, then all the leashes come off the state control of violence. And just to diverge a moment for the present day, that's where we are at the moment. You can compare the restraint on violence that was applied to, say, the January 6th rioters with the restraint of violence of the summer of 2020 rioters. And you can see this enormous difference. So that will, there's another tangent on that we'll come back to. But first, let me complete the historical sketch here. That is, so during these 30 years, what happened was this established authority of the church and the accommodation of the state fell apart. There was, well, the Holy Roman Empire was crumbling. As it was commonly said, it was never either a Holy Roman or an empire. And that's true. But that not only was crumbling, but also too, the church was, ever since the appearance of Luther on the scene in the early 16th century, its authority too was crumbling. There was a temporary accommodation made in 1555 with the Treaty of Augsburg, which established the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, meaning that whoever's the prince of a certain province, his religion will rule. And so with the Treaty of Westphalia, that was reestablished. And that also too created this unique trajectory in the evolution of the state. I said that the state was created in 1648, and the Treaty of Westphalia is unique in certain senses. That is, most importantly, its obsession with sovereignty. Now, why was it obsessed with sovereignty? To digress one more time, in history, sovereignty in the medieval sense was not absolute. Sovereignty in the medieval sense signified a number of overlapping sovereignties, For example, the king was in no way sovereign in the modern sense. He was primarily a judge, and also his sovereignty was limited by his place in what Lovejoy has called the great chain of being. It was not absolute. He owed fealty to God, and there was this interlocking network of fealties that limited the power of everyone, especially the sovereignty of the king. So, with that falling apart, the inevitable question arose in every discussion about government, and that is, who is the final arbiter? That is the primary question regarding sovereignty. And with the waning of the legitimacy of both the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church, that question was predominant. And also, too, it was especially important now, that is, in the early 17th century, because some solution had to be found to avoid this this catastrophic civil war between these religious groups. So, what was unique about the Treaty of Westphalia is that its obsession with sovereignty, as I just said, and also the fact that its first principle was to deal with the question of contending religious faiths. So one of the principles, as I just mentioned in the definition of the state, is that it purports to protect a catalog of rights. And what is our First Amendment right? The right to free expression of religion. So in a sense, the First Amendment of our Constitution is given with the founding of the state by guaranteeing this right to expression of religion. In the past, there was, to avoid the religious persecution, the established rule now was that if there was someone within your society that was opposed to your religion, you must give them free passage. You must not consider them evil. You just let them out of your territory, and away they go, to avoid this catastrophic conflict. And here's another third important aspect of the Treaty of Westphalia. There were no kings there. It was conducted by basically public intellectuals. So here we have another key property of the state, and that is you need the presence of intellectuals to confer its legitimacy. So this group of essentially a huge number of diplomats got together without their kings and said, here, we've got to fix this. And so this entity, which established the characteristics of the state, began then. So that's a little bit long-winded, but anyway, I think it establishes what I was trying to do, or what I am trying to do with this book, and also why its tendency is toward totalitarianism.
Do you want to go back to talking about the evil categorization of the January 6 folks versus the lauding of the 2020 rioters?
Okay, well, that's important too, because another aspect of the state is that it founds its decisions on a presumed universality. Mm-hmm. In other words, the state must allocate public goods, and it must always make the assumption that it is allocating these goods for universal benefit. So one community may get a road between A and B, but a complaining community would, by compensation, get, say, a post office. The goods, and this arose during the war between the states, one part of society cannot profit at the expense of another. The South cannot pay by tariffs the industrial expansion of the North. But on a more abstract level as well, say, for example, the universal acceptance that government must suppress violence. Here, this presumption of universality fails. The government always favors one group over or against another. And the perfect example of that is the one we just cited, and that is the different treatment of lawbreakers, favoring a more lenient application of the law for those on the left, and a more stringent punitive application of the law for those on the right. So this presumption of universality is another one of the key failures of the state. It's a presumption that cannot be sustained.
Yes, so the state form of government has reached a historical and philosophical dead end. So you go to great lengths within your book to talk about that. And then you say the only viable replacement government is claristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
That is a sort of democracy, not sort of, sortive, as in sortition, which is based on ecotarctonics, which is a new category of praxeology. So let's talk about what some of these terms mean. What do you mean by claristocracy?
It derives from the Greek word kleros, meaning lot or random lot. And it's the same thing exactly as the Latin word sortition, which derives from the Latin word sors, which is also a random lot. And it should be more widely known, but the ancient Greek application of democracy relied essentially on this random selection of public officers. In fact, every public officer in ancient Greek was chosen by random lot, except for one, and that is the head of the military. The commander-in-chief was chosen by other means. Now, this may have originated in religious practice by divination, for example, but it was so practically powerful in the political practical sense that, again, it was adopted for every office in government. And the practice of claristocracy, it was not called claristocracy, but in other more successful societies, it was practiced as well. Let's see, well, I can cite that. A far longer lived example of government is the Venetian what might be called claristocracy. It wasn't called that, but it relied on its selection of officers by random lot. So the current state has been in existence for less than 400 years, but the Venetian Republic, again, resting on the selection of officers by random lot, existed exactly 1100 years from the selection of the first Doge in 1697 till the vanquishing of the Venetian Republic by Napoleon I in 1797. So at its heyday, the Venetian Republic was one of the 5 most populous and prosperous republics, or actually states, governments, I must say, in all of Europe. So it was not a fluke in it by any means. And the fact that it existed so long is proof of the durability of this principle. So I got diverted in our previous discussion in how the mechanics of claristocracy worked in the ancient sense. So we're going to skip that.
Okay.
But it's more practical today because all of these really arcane mechanisms that both the ancient Greeks and the Venetians used to guarantee some kind of randomness in the selection is now assured by quantum physics. By the application of quantum physics, we can get true randomness. And that's actually a rare thing. The universe hates randomness. Nature seeks pattern, and human beings even more so. So to now have this tool at hand that guarantees true randomness, we can pick people not on their glibness or some unknown facility for being elected, but we can choose them based on true randomness. Now, while we're on the subject, I have to discuss some of the recent applications of sortition. It's been mainly recently, in the past 15 or 18 years, a tool of the left. And just to quickly cite from my notes some of these applications, there was the 2015 Irish Constitutional Convention on Marriage Equity. There was the 2018 Irish Assembly on primarily abortion, and there were two climate assemblies, one in France during 2019, 2020, and one in the UK, in Great Britain, during those same 2 years. And all of these examples have certain features in common. For one thing, and most importantly, they all reach leftist policy conclusions. And the reason for that is all of these assemblies were held on a very tight leash by the governments that accepted their use. So the randomly chosen allotted people who made up these assemblies were typically 100 in number, and always less than 150. And always there was the application of demographic stratification. That's another term that needs to be explained. So stratification means that within a particular sample, you will have subsamples that must be represented. And demographic stratification means that you've got to have a certain number of Blacks, of women, of disabled people, of rural versus urban people, and so on, so as to achieve representation. But here is where sortition breaks down. They cling to the absolute necessity of representation. And this is folly. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted without there being a single person of color, as we say nowadays, in either chamber of Congress, either chamber of Congress. And also, too, the Title VII provisions from that guaranteed protections for women in the workplace was only enacted when there were about a dozen women only. So the point of that is this fetish for representation is entirely misplaced. One more example too. Currently, the vast majority of Black people want police robustly present in their neighborhoods, while on the other hand, their representatives of the same color are consistently against that. They want to defund the police. So representation is a fetish that is entirely misplaced. And there are several other failings too that I must bring up to justify my reapplication of sortition. I'm a member of a group that tries to implement sortition around the United States. And I am the only representative who wants that applied for purposes of the right. Every other member wants to, like all of these previously cited examples, apply it to reach leftist policy conclusions. And here are the three errors that I find that make it completely a fraud, that in its current application, it only serves to give legitimacy to leftist governments. All of these leftist governments tried these examples only because they knew in advance that they could keep these randomly selected bodies on a short leash and drive them to conclusions reached already in advance. But anyway, the first failing is that, like the state, it claims universality. It says that if we reach a conclusion that is demographically stratified, it must be something that universally represents the society. But that is not the case. It's simply a standard of justice posing as a deontological universal standard. The second failing is that it uses group deliberation. That is, everybody all of these 100 or 150 people get into a room and try to decide whether there should be marriage equity in Ireland, which of course was accepted. Now there's marriage of homosexuals there, and whether there should be abortion in Ireland. Yes, that was accepted too. And this practice of having group deliberation thwarts the wisdom of crowds. There is a wisdom of crowds that states that the group can reach conclusions that are smarter than particular individuals in the group. Now this assertion of mine has been proven by, or asserted at least, by a Nobel laureate, Daniel Kahneman, who says that group deliberation defeats this wisdom of crowds. And finally, in my opinion, the order is exactly wrong. It places the irrational formation of the pool first, followed by the presumptively rational, but in fact subjective standard. Now, let me unpack that a little bit. There are some cases, ironically, where the best rational outcome is reached irrationally, and sortition and the selection of officers for service in a society is one of those cases. In the case of Venice and in the case of ancient Greece, the principle was that picking some member randomly from the pool, from that initial pool, did not affect the outcome of excellence once that person was chosen. In other words, in ancient Greece, the people who were chosen by lot to become officers were more or less equally qualified. Also, too, in the case of Venice, the people who formed the initial pool for random selection were aristocrats with a common, primarily mercantile interest in the state. So the failure of the current use of sortition gets that exactly wrong. It's exactly the wrong way around. So in the current application, you could, for example, pick people randomly, and you have the entire group completely unqualified. You could have, I don't know, a farmer, you could have a person who's uneducated, you could have a street hobo, I suppose. But the point of that is, by not having that qualitatively indifferent initial pool, you are forced into adopting these stratification categories. So in other words, to make sure you don't have a room full of dummies deciding policy for your society, you've got to say, well, we'll have a certain number that are in this demographic group, a certain number here and there and there, and we'll make sure that at least some of these, there are only going to be a sum of those people who are completely unqualified. So anyway, that's kind of a long-winded explanation of the difference between the current application of that and my adaptation of it that I think should work because it worked once again in Athens for all of their elected officials, and it worked for 11 centuries in one of the most prosperous republics in all of Europe, the Venetian Republic.
Now, we have something like that with jury duty. Would you say that's a modern example that people could wrap their head around?
That's a good point. Jury duty is one example, but I guess an illustration of its failure would be given in that movie 12 Angry Men. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
In any case,
Trying to think if I ever saw it.
Oh, well.
I remember hearing about it.
Well, in that film, Jimmy Stewart, of course, was one of the jurists who was, and he had to contend with, frankly, a bunch of idiots who wanted to get out of that room,
right,
and condemn someone who was innocent of a crime. So, yes, it is an example of sortition, but it's also an example of how it can fail.
Correct. So one of the lines from your book is the Enlightenment ideal that a minimal code of values can apply universally has been completely repudiated. You give a bunch of examples. So for the sortition to work, there needs to be some kind of commonality. Even though these people are randomly chosen, there has to be something that binds them together so that they serve a common good purpose. Is that why, it would have to be done at the smaller levels, not just the state of
Absolutely.
Texas, but you talk a lot about counties within the book too. So parse that out for us.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And your insistence on commonality of this initial pool is critical, and it can't be reached at the national level. If you look at the number of people that a single representative is supposed to represent, it's absurd. It can't be done, especially if there's not a quorum, if there's a bare quorum, if there's a bare majority reached, then the number of people represented by that representative grows enormously. So the idea of representation is defeated there. But if you have a smaller community, and I take the round number of between 250,000 and 300,000 from my reading of Donald Livingston, he's researched the subject fairly well, but he seems to think that, generally speaking, that is an ideal number for a small community. And so I apply that to Texas counties. Now, Texas counties, some of them are extremely tiny. There's one county I think has maybe 17,000 people. And then there's the Harris County that surrounds Houston, which if you break it up into 250,000 groups, it creates, I think, something like eight different distinct counties. So in any case, yes, that's absolutely important, because you can reach no commonality in a group as gigantic as 3.4 million, 320 or 30 million Americans. And that's another tangent that we can go off on, that America is in fact composed of at least a dozen different separate nations. But in any case, what determines that commonality? I just said previously that there is no universality in the claims of the state, or that is that the claim makes such claims, but they are invalid. They must always allot public goods to favor, that will favor, whether they want it or not, one group over another. So the county implements, in my treatment in the book, the unique vision of Alasdair MacIntyre. Alasdair MacIntyre has come up with a solution to the consequentialist deontological dilemma. Deontology says that there are absolutes, universals, that apply in all cases, regardless of consequence. That's the extreme statement of it, that regardless of consequences, there are moral actions that we can pursue. While on the other hand, the consequentialism, which is essentially utilitarianism, says that we can ignore these universal truths and just find out by trial and error, essentially, what benefits the most people in Jeremy Bentham's eudaimonic calculus. So both of those positions, and we can go into that, are failures. Just briefly on consequentialism, it fails because you cannot know the ethical value of a consequentialist proposition until it happens in the future. In other words, you can't plan that, I don't know, an increase in schools in this state will produce X number of scholars. You have to try it out. You can make guesses, but to allocate public funds for that purpose is basically a matter of trial and error. And on the other hand, just to pick up on that utilitarian example, if you say on the other hand that we are going to make sure that Blacks have equal standing in society as whites, and we're going to, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, we're going to fund Blacks in a way that makes them really equal to the economic results of other races. So the consequence of that, of course, was the decimation of the Black family. So that policy is still being followed because it represents the other horn of the dilemma, the extreme form being the deontology of saying that we're going to follow this course of moral action regardless of consequence. And the state does this all the time, not only by its welfare policies, but also which are pursued in defiance of abundant evidence that it hurts the very people that it's intended to help. But also the war on drugs, for example. We still have the war on drugs, even though there's abundant empirical evidence that it does not work. And yet it must be pursued because of the universalist tendency of the state. It says that we must have a policy driven by an ethical position that does not consider the consequences. It is morally right. And we, as the state, are legitimate in imposing it. So,
now, can I ask you a quick question?
sure.
What would the actualization of kleristocracy solve some of the corruption? Because the war on drugs makes me also think that a lot of people get very rich off of it too, people who are our authorities, right? So would the randomness keep a lot of that at bay? Is that the thinking?
Oh, absolutely. Here's the thing. It's in a nutshell. Sortition, kleristocracy annihilates politics. You institute kleristocracy, politics cease to exist because there is always the dispute over what should be distributed, what should be allocated in public funds is now chosen under kleristocracy by the group of people who have been chosen for a standard of excellence. There is no politicking. There is no posturing on the national stage about the supposed benefits of the Green New Deal or the elimination of fossil fuels or whatever policy gets a person elected. And so we need to return at this point to your previous question, and that is, why the small scale? Why the small scale? David Hume asserted that ethics were a matter of the passions, that there is no objective status for standards of right and wrong. Now, when I say that we must reject the universality, the assertions of universality of the state, I don't say that there are no universal standards. I say that they simply cannot be imposed at that scale. The only practical way of reaching this consensus, as you mentioned, for a certain polity, a certain society, is to have it as small as possible. Now, say for example, a Texas county, which has been divided up, according to my book, into groups of, say, 250,000. Say one of them wants to institute public hanging. Right now, that's a great offense, and it would never, that's a great offense to many people, and it would never, ever even be suggested except for political suicide on the national stage. But they would be free to do that. They would also be free, if they can't find a random pool of people with enough smarts, free to enact things like the banishment of the Muslim religion from their county. And incidentally, speaking of small scale communities having a voice, in Switzerland, I think this happened in about 2012. The Swiss people have a power of referendum. They can put things before the legislature that are not in separation from any legislative initiative. So if a certain number of people say, we want this to be voted on, it has to be voted on. So a great number of people wanted, a vast number of people wanted no minarets in Switzerland, and it passed because the community is Christian, and therefore they were willing and able, because of the federalist system that they have and the initiative and referendum powers that they have, able to enforce their policy. So you can see how that would fail on the national scale. Only a tiny number of things can possibly, well, there are almost no, I should revise this, saying there are almost no policies that can get universal agreement. In the past, when the national government was limited to those 17 enumerated powers in the 1787 Constitution, yes, there were all of this local policy was decided effectively at the state level. So you can see now with everything, especially banished constitutionally by the Cooper versus Aaron 1958 decision that I cited earlier, being cited at the national level, it's just an inevitable cauldron of contention.
So let's get back to a little bit of government versus non-state government. And we have this claristocratic thing that you want to occur. Who are the people that keep the standard of excellence as part of the standard? Like, who governs that the standard of excellence to be randomly pulled are even met? How does that work?
Well, once again, in distinction from David Hume, I do not say that these standards are based in the passions or have no objective status. They do, but they can only be attempted at the local level. Okay. And so a particular community, say a county in my examples, can it depends on whatever the county wants. It can
right, what the standards are. But yeah, I guess there's not like a reigning board that makes sure that, I think that's what I mean. That, well, I know that's what I mean. Who makes that type of non-state governance like move down the track, that a standard of excellence is going to be kept. This is how we do things. Is it how is that enforced, I guess, is the question.
Okay, well, there must be. I'm not someone who wants to wipe the slate clean and start from scratch. There has to be a transition from what we have now. So right now at the state of Texas county level, we have a board of commissioners.
Okay.
It's 5 people. The head of it is the county judge, and he's called a judge. Maybe he was originally, but he doesn't have to have any legal status as a judge.
Interesting.
If he doesn't have if he's not a member of the state bar, he does have to pass a test, but the test is very weak. His status is really an administrator of the county. So initially, the board of commissioners would say, here's our standard of excellence. It would say that beneath the very few articles that are enforced at the state level, and I'm thinking very few, meaning the first 8 amendments of our U.S. Constitution. Beyond that, everything devolves to the county. The county then says, in addition to these very universal principles like freedom of religion or being safe and secure in your property, no unreasonable searches or seizures, the right to bear arms, et cetera, we will enforce our own list, our own constitution, kind of a county constitution, if you will. And you say, well, what if it's capricious? What if crazy things are put into the county? It may well be. That is, if the people who are in charge at the current moment or at the moment of transition are foolish, but they'll only be foolish for a short time. Okay. Because if they do something very stupid, the people will leave. They will simply go to another county. And they have in the state of Texas 254 choices, 254 counties in the state of Texas. So, and here's the heart of the matter. If there's nothing else remembered from our conversation, it's this, and that is, there must be in every polity, in every society, a final arbiter. This was established at the very beginning with Jean Baudin, with Les 6 Livres de la République at the end of the 16th century, who said that there cannot be an endless chain of decision makers. There must be eventually a final one. Of course, in those days, the final decision maker was the Almighty God. But Hobbes said that there is a final decision maker. In fact, on earth, and he called him, quote, a mortal god. That didn't seem to put anybody off in those days.
Hmm.
But so this point has been raised again by a scholar who was employed at the University of New Mexico. I think now he's in Florida. Alfred Cruzon, and his article was provocatively titled, "Do We Ever Get Out of Anarchy?" And in fact, we don't. The final arbiter is, in a sense, anarchic because he stands outside the law as a judge of the law. We have this pretense that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of things, but it's really not. There's for example, the Supreme Court ruled that Title 42 should be enforced for keeping immigrants south of the border of Texas. So what the Biden government did was say, well, secretly they said, with Administrator Mayorkas in charge, said that we will obey that by keeping a few hundred. We'll keep a few hundred in Title 42 camps. But in all other matters, we will not only allow, but we vociferously encourage people to migrate illegally into the United States. So in that case, who is the final arbiter?
Right.
Whoever it is, they will make some pretense of legitimacy to their claim, unlike Hobbes, who said that that's just the way it is. We got to have a final one, and it's going to be the monarch. But everyone will attempt that. There must be someone who is the final arbiter. So if that is true, then you're either in a national government where there is some final arbiter, whether it's contended, as I just suggested, within the Supreme Court and the chief executive, and you can't escape, or there will be a tiny final arbiter. There'll be a final arbiter over a tiny domain. So in that case, the caprice, if you will, of the final arbiter is threatened by the fear of abandonment. If the county acts capriciously, people just leave. So you cannot escape anarchy. The fact is, the question is not whether there will be anarchy, but who will enjoy it. And I say it must be enjoyed at the smallest possible level. Otherwise, you're trapped within an inescapable prison where you're subject to this national final arbiter.
Right. Especially when you consider the United States, not just how big it is geographically, but the globo homogenization that's pushed from the West on pretty much the rest of the globe. So yes, smaller is better. Go ahead.
Small is beautiful.
Yes, absolutely. So subjective theory of value. Does this have to do anything with what you were just discussing? You say in the book, just as the subjective theory of value establishes economics, so it establishes reason as the directing agency of political affairs in a community polity. So tell me how your use of it differs in the Austrian term, and then I want to talk about reason a little bit.
Okay. Well, you hit exactly on the right point. In fact, I'm a bit shocked that it hasn't been applied to government. So just to briefly go over it, in the case of the Austrians, that is the discovery of especially Ludwig von Mises, where he explains this in his masterwork, Human Action. And he says that well, first of all, back up a tiny bit. He says there are only two ways of knowing, by causality and by teleology. He means, to give examples, in the first case, Causality is things like physics, chemistry, and so on, where there's this, what he calls concatenation of phenomena. You can always back up to say that A explains B, explains C, and so on. But in the other way of knowing, by teleology, that's telos means end, and of course, the study of ends. So he asserts that there are only these two ways of knowing. With teleology, reason is applied to the study of how that end is reached. Now, and he says that the way that the ends are reached among these various people is unknowable. In other words, his application of the subjectivity of value says that we cannot make interpersonal comparisons between citizen A, who says that I should have this level of money or I should have this status, and citizen B, who says that, well, I should have this in addition to a vacation. Well, what it comes down to is the market transaction where property is actually exchanged. Where the rubber meets the road, where the real decision comes, is where you give up. You say that this end is more important than another. That is, say I have $500. That allows me to reach a certain number of ends, but I'm willing to sacrifice it for, say, a week of study in a conference. So you make these interpersonal comparisons are impossible without a market transaction. So this does not have to be conscious. For example, you can say, I today am not taking the straight way home. I'm taking the long way along the riverside. Now, someone may offer the critique, well, that's not something that the economic man would do. He would make the shortcut. No, in every case, human beings have to decide between a lesser good and a greater good. And it does not have to be a conscious decision. So you can say, I'll take my walk along the riverside without even considering, well, I'm sacrificing a lost 15 minutes that I could have spent at home. You simply do it. Nevertheless, that calculation of the value of that 15 minutes compared to the walk along the riverside can only be calculated by catalactics, according to von Mises. In other words, the monetary value that is sacrificed by that savings of time is the person who takes the walk is willing to forego it for the enjoyment of the walk along the riverside. So in any case, this is very convenient because it is the foundation of his price theory. He says that that socialism must fail because there's no mechanism of pricing. It fails because the market provides this catalactic assessment of the relative worth of ends of every person in a society. Without the subjective theory of value, we would be guessing at whether a government should build a road, a tank, guns or butter, and all those things. So it's the basis of all economics, really. And it's really ironic that an existence of a subjective value affords the foundation for an objective assessment of the allocation of human ends. And anyway, that's the application of the theory in praxeology. And the difference, and the thing that I do is somewhat different in application is that it simply applies it to the larger group. And I'm kind of surprised that it seems to me obvious that no one else has asserted this. But and if there's something wrong with my assertion of it, I'd like to hear from somebody. But it seems to me that communities, societies, polities have ends just in a similar way that individual humans do. And the calculation of these intersubjective values is impossible in both cases. That is, in a non-market situation or in a larger policy, a larger polity, without the foundation of the subjective theory of value.
Now, when you use the term reason, you're not using it so much in the Enlightenment way, because reason is a term that often like triggers Orthodox Christians. Oh, it's too Enlightenment, and it's going to be man-centered. It's not making room for the divine or understanding, our role in nature, because it was made by God as a gift for us. So is there a Christian ethos behind some of your ideas? Your architectonics does some meddling with the symbols of religion, and some would say that that violates separation of church and state. What do you say? Tell me what you mean by reason, and if there's a Christian ethos, and why you do some meddling with symbols of religion.
Well, in the case of praxeology, reason is applied by this objective determination of market values founded on the subjective theory of value. In my case, the subjective theory of values allows these different, go back a step. Praxeology says the opposite of that sense of reason is simply like digestion or sneezing. It's, in other words, the automatic processes of a human being. In my case, the application of the subjective theory of value says that reason is the attempt to achieve a standard of excellence according to the virtue ethics of Alasdair MacIntyre. We can go into that on another deviation. The opposite of that is the unconscious realization of group values through the symbols of religion. I assert that there must be government, meaning that no human being can live alone. They must be in a community. And that community must try, according to its understanding of reason, whatever that may be, to reach its standard of excellence. For example, one society may say that we're going to chop off hands for thieves, as they do in Saudi Arabia, or that we're going to stone to death unbelievers, as they do in Pakistan. They think that's reasonable. We don't. So each community makes its best attempt.
Got it.
To say that one is more reasonable than another is really talking nonsense. So then your question comes up, and that is, well, if what is unreasonable? Unreasonable means that since we must have a community of some kind reaching some standard of excellence, then it's either conscious, or that is reasoned as best we can according to symbiotic reason, or it must, these goals, these community goals must be asserted in some way. And the only other way is by using symbols of religion. So that doesn't mean that religion must be unreasoned. It simply means that there are symbols of religion that have a force even among atheists that are recognizable. There's a wonderful phrase from, I think, Erich von Kuhnelt-Leden, who says that modern society exists on the whiff from an empty bottle that used to be filled with Christianity. And in many cases, that's true. So here we can go off the deep end and do some theological explanation. One of the assertions in my book, or implicit in the book in any case, is that politics is at bottom theology. And I'm not the first to say this. Carl Schmitt, the previously cited Eric von Kuhnelt, and many others have said that. And what does that mean? Well, a perfect example is in the current two polar political parties. The conservatives hold the fundamental theological principle that man's nature is fixed and fallen. On the other hand, on the left, they assert that man's nature is plastic and perfectible. So these are theological positions. They're irreconcilable. And you try to make them reconciled on a national level, and it's an invitation it's a formula for conflict, inevitable conflict. So the only way to resolve that is, once again, going back to the small scale communities. So
is that what theosity is, what you just stated?
Yes. Theodicy is a term actually coined by Wilhelm Leibniz, but he deals with these questions that came up in the 16th and 17th centuries in theological terms. And in fact, the entire discussion in the 16th and 17th century was initially based in theological considerations. So, and even now, or in the case of John Rawls, this still holds true. For example, Rawls initially wanted to go into wanted to become I don't know what the religion was. Maybe it's Presbyterianism. I forget. But in any case, he wanted to enter theology. He wanted to be a divine, not a political scientist. And he was self-consciously anti-Pelagian. He was steadfastly Augustinian. And this is the very same discussion that was rehashed in the 16th and 17th centuries, this discussion of free will and determinism, respectively, in the sense of that of Pelagius and St. Augustine. And in fact, I have it here. After I had written my little book, David Gordon of the Mises Institute was kind enough to review what I had done. In fact, he provides a blurb on the back of the book, very positive. I'm proud of it. He suggested that what I was saying was similar to what was written by a recent publication from Eric Nelson called The Theology of Liberalism. Eric Nelson's book says that Rawls killed liberalism because, here's another quote, liberalism began as a theodicy. He's saying that all of the primary exponents of liberalism, and he, by the way, contrary to my own view, says that liberalism can be sustained in a national state.
You're talking about like classical liberalism?
Yes, very good point. Classical liberalism. So yes, Rawls said that
it could be maintained.
Yeah. So my quote was that from Eric Nelson is that liberalism began life as a theodicy, meaning this discussion between free will and determinism. And this is very, very important because, for example, in Rawls, and we can go into Rawls if you want, but Rawls had this principle of fairness. That was what he's trying to establish, based essentially on Christian principles, but misguided, I think. He saw the main problem of differences in a community as not so important as recognizing that everybody, low to high, accomplished to not accomplished, were essentially recipients of God's gift. In other words, every benefit that we enjoy, high or low, is a gift that no one should claim any personal responsibility for it. And this is perfect Augustinian determinism that reincarnated in the doctrines of Calvinism. So you may say, well, okay, I've got that. That's interesting. But I have some Calvinists, some Augustinians who are members of the Republican Party, and they want a limited government. But really, really do they? They are still driven by these theological considerations, principle of which is Christology. Everybody who's on the left and right with a, how would you say, religious orientation, is convinced of a Christology that views a Jesus patibilis, meaning a suffering Jesus. But should that be the case? It's this view, this fixed view of Christ as a suffering agent, that I think drives this common acceptance that inequality is unjust. Even conservatives have the ground cut out from under their feet all the time, simply because, say to them, as the liberals, the leftists do, that what you're proposing is unjust, and they immediately fold. They can offer no really convincing moral case that whatever their policy may be is unjust in some ways, but can be justified. And that too, the principal assertion of Rawls is that everybody can agree, as the initial position, that there should be fairness, that there should be not fairness in the sense of a fairness, equality before the law, but equality of result among a community. So actually, someone like myself can say, no, you don't want equality. You want inequality. For example, you can have a John much richer than a Paul. And is this unequal? Yes, it's unequal, but is it unfair? So John may be a physician who's able to cure illnesses in Paul. So that's a net gain for both of them. It's unequal, yes, but is it unjust? No, it is not. And so nowadays, especially on the extreme left, people eagerly point to any inequality and claim that it is unjust without any logic.
Right. Now you talked about Rawls. Do you claim that the Eckhart architectonics, I'm going to get it, refutes John Rawls and Robert Nozick, two of the most important political philosophers of our time? So architectonics, what is it? And go into Rawls and Nozick and what you think about them and if you're refuting them.
Yes, I am attempting to refute them. I've touched on Rawls a little bit. Architectonics is simply the application of the application of the principles of praxeology to the higher level of government. And I think Rawls is really fairly easy to refute. For one thing, just to state his position, he says that natural distribution, the way we find ourselves unequally situated in society, is neither in itself just nor unjust. He says that it's the way that institutions deal with justice or this unequal natural distribution that is just or unjust. Now, to me, right there, that's begging the question right there. So these institutions are an attempt to remedy something that he has initially conceded as being neither just nor unjust. So how does he propose to remedy a problem when in fact no problem may exist? In other words, this natural state of this natural, how do you call it, unequal distribution of goods and talents is not just or unjust. So why should there be an attempt to fix it? So in my case, and I assert quite plainly that you want more inequality. You want more inequality because it's the guys like the previously cited John, who's able to help the less able Pauls and deserves his status, his unequal superior status. Also, too, I'm keen on the question of randomness, and this less fortunately situated Paul can say, well, this is my lot in life. It's not my fault. There's in fact, it's nobody's fault. It's just the way it is. And therefore, there's no failing attached to me. Right now, there's this implication that if you're not equally situated to some superior or supposed superior, then there's some immoral failing in you. And that's simply not the case. Right now, the poorest person in America, the worst off person in our society, is immeasurably better off than the kings and potentates of yesterday. So, and it's because that capitalism allowed this inequality to thrive, to allow the unequally superior man to confer benefits on society as a whole. So his very first premise, the guiding idea of equality, and not equality of the law, he means equality in the sense of fairness, is completely wrong. So that's his initial position. His initial position is that everybody, all free, well, here I can quote from him, I have notes. He says that, quote, the guiding idea is that the principle of justice for the basic structure of society are the object of the original agreement. They are the principles that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality. So once again, I don't see how that works. His second step is assumption of this veil of ignorance. He says that, okay, supposing this just cited premise, you would also have to endorse a veil of ignorance. And a veil of ignorance states that we don't know what our lot in life will be. If we're starting out building this new society, according to this theory of justice, we don't know if we're going to be dealt a bad hand of cards that puts us at the bottom or at the top. But not only that, his veil of ignorance completely annihilates the definition of a human being. He says that we don't know what society we're born in. We don't know who our parents were. We don't even know if our culture, what our culture is, what time of life we're in. All of that is completely wiped out. So this available ignorance creates not a a, a, a human being that that can be used as a heuristic for his just society. It creates a non-entity. It creates a non-human. So
That sounds like what we got now running around.
and also too, he makes a further assumption, and this, in my estimation, even if it was the only assumption he made, is absolutely fatal. He excludes envy from his description of his theory of justice. At least at the beginning, he says we can bring it in later after we see what a wonderful society we have made by first excluding it. No, envy, in my view, is one of the premier problems of society, and I mean destructive envy. And we can go off on that tangent, but yeah. let me first take a brief mention of Robert Nozick. As you know, A Theory of Justice was written in 1971, and 3 years later, Robert Nozick offered essentially a libertarian reply. And he is undone by several fatal errors. One of them is given by Murray Rothbard. Rothbard says that everything that Nozick concludes to justify a limited government can be equally applied to a gigantic government. So, in other words, Nozick's whole purpose is to legitimize a limited government. And in fact, he's, according to Rothbard at least, equally made legitimate a Leviathan.
Right.
And also another failing is in one section, well, there are many failings, like his can of tomato juice. We'll touch on that in a minute. He says that there must be a, quote, rough rule of thumb for unquote, for correcting injustice. Well, this concedes everything. What is this rough rule of thumb? So if he concedes that there's some injustice that needs correcting, he's got another book to write. Of course, he's dead, but and also too, it seems that Nozick established this obsession with libertarians on John Locke. John Locke's second treatise of government, especially section 27, where he talks about property. All libertarians are obsessed with determining original ownership. And to me, it's a complete non-problem. But libertarians just won't give it up. They have to somehow justify property by establishing some legitimate justification for the initial acquisition of property, whether it's by a gift, by homesteading or conquest, whatever it is. It's just a waste of time. And here, the reason I say that is, for example, say that, I'll take the example given by Eric Nelson, and he raises problems with Nozick. He says that, say that a person creates a water glass, a very nice water glass, and he sells it to another person. That person sells it, but then a third person steals it. The thief continues to sell it throughout the ages, and it comes down to you, and you're holding a glass. Okay, how valid is your property? Did that one case of theft invalidate your ownership? So this problem is taken up by Edmund Burke as well. He says that whatever the origin of property, it would be such a manifest inconvenience for those now holding the property that we must ignore it. And that's my position. I say you can't fix this. And so trying to historically or even argumentatively, a prioristically try to fix it is just a waste of time.
Now, let's get away from philosophy a little bit and a little bit into the meat and potatoes of the second part of the book. So, non-state government. What is the difference between it and with other decentralist movements like national divorce? I mean, we know like the nooks and crannies philosophically, but how would one succeed more than the other? Because, that's always what people are going to hear, theories and all these great ideas, but how is it going to be actualized? So tell me what you think about that. And yeah, that'll be it for now.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a good point. And in fact, there are many people among our contemporaries who recognize essentially that small is beautiful and that communities should be that way. One of them is a guy named John, I'll think of his name in a minute. John Haygood is what I think. Anyway, his position is what he calls foundationalism. And essentially, it has much in common with what I say, but he tacks on this need for considering exploration of the universe. In other words, he says that there is what he calls a communitarian principle that should drive the new foundation of the society that should emerge from the failure of the state. We agree on that point. But he says that it should incorporate some concept of exploring other universes for settlement. That's kind of wild. And also, too, there's another example. The British comedian and I don't know, political pundit Russell Brand. Russell Brand, every time he speaks about these matters, he says that we need a small community. We don't need a vast government. Well, okay. Tell me what you got. Tell me how you're going to work that out. Because as you suggest, there are many ways to work it out. And my way is to take the many natural advantages that Texas offers and apply it to the Texas county. For example, as I said before, there are 254 Texas counties, and these can be divided in a conveniently small communitarian. I purposely shy away from that word. I use the word instead symbiotic, in order to get away from this legacy of philosophical legacy that's packed in to the word communitarian. So anyway, but you may consider them synonymous for our purposes. But in any case, there are other advantages too. For example, Texas has its own deep water ports. It has its own electrical grid. Of course, it has its own fossil fuel supply and its own network of pipelines. It has its own now gold bullion depository in Leander, Texas, which is a few miles north of Austin. And now there are two bills in the Texas legislature that propose to create a digital currency backed by the gold held in Leander. So if Texas were to become an independent republic, it would rank about equal, given in terms of comparison of GDP, to Great Britain. It would be about 11th in all the nations of the world. So in all of this, as I assert or propose in my book, founded on these symbiotic communities in the Texas counties.
And you chose Texas. You live in Mexico or had been living in Mexico, but you're a Texas native, correct?
Yes.
Now, would all the states have to be abolished? Would there have to be a complete disintegration for Texas to move forward with this? Or are you saying Texas does this first and models it for others?
Well, that's a good question. Here's what I foresee happening. I think Texas should avoid any flamboyant declaration of independence. That would simply, if they were to do so initially, that would, especially given the current administration, invite violent reprisal. And incidentally, you can say that nullification, or at least interposition, is going on right now with among sanctuary cities and among the allowance of marijuana usage. Now, it's interesting. In both of those cases, I think they're given a free pass by the national government, which could, I guess, legally step in and crush both cases of that, sanctuary cities and marijuana legalization. But they don't, because those are propositions on the left. However, if Texas were to assert anything like interposition, nullification, or secession, that's a stridently rightist position, which would not be countenanced by the federal government. So, yeah, that's my position on those things.
Okay. What do you think is going to happen to this thing called America? Is it going to fall apart by hook or crook, because it already is, and we're just going to see that occur? And Brian McClanahan recently, I was listening to him, and he was saying that when things fall apart, people tend to, throughout history, to centralize when that happens. But I personally don't see that happening in America, because in those historical examples he used, those people were actually nations. And I don't technically think we meet the definition of a nation. So what do you think about all that? Is it going to fall apart? Will people seek centralization, or something like what you are putting forward?
Yeah, it's inevitable. The differences are so profound, as I said before, rooted in theological differences that are just intractable. But to use Brian McClanahan's example against himself, I might ask him, well, what happened with the collapse of the Roman Empire? You didn't have centralization. You had complete dispersion. You had hundreds and hundreds of principalities in the Holy Roman Empire. The collapse was followed by dispersion, not by centralization at all. Now, to address your question, last night, in fact, I listened to a speech given by a friend who is president of the Texas Nationalist Movement, of which I am a member. And in fact, the movement now claims almost 500,000 paying members.
Wow.
These are not people who, are enthusiastic or saying, yeah, I kind of like that, to a pollster. They put the money down. They put $60 down a month to say, we want Texas out of here. So his point last night that he made, he says, we've got to be careful. This has to be a process whereby we don't stick our neck out and provoke the violence of the federal government. To answer your question in a different way, I can cite for what may seem at first to be a contradictory proof, and that is given by the 1869 judgment by Salmon Chase of Texas versus White. Most people cite that saying, well, Texas versus White, 1869, said that Texas can't secede. Well, that's the end of it. Supreme Court's already ruled. But in fact, in paragraph 101 of his decision, he said that there are two he said that, yes, the United States is in an indissoluble union, a perpetual union. That's a complete myth fabricated by Justice Story and Abraham Lincoln, which you already know. But he said that it's a perpetual union, but there are two ways out. One is by revolution, and two is by the consent of the other states. So even in his rendering, there could be a constitutional convention that says, okay, Texas is got to go. It's just too much of a burden. We're going to let it go. Of course, politically speaking, those of the left could very well make that argument, because with all of the electors from the solidly red state of Texas gone, what would happen? America would become another California. Period. So the leftists should wish us to be gone.
Yeah.
Constitutionally, they should say, let's have a convention. There's currently a convention of state society that want a convention for other reasons, but they could say very well, let's have one for getting rid of Texas, and that will be all California from coast to coast.
All right.
So
what are some of the opposing views when people who have read the book or you've had conversations with? One of the things is when I talk about secession, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I just say what we're doing now isn't working and everybody's pretty miserable. The failings are everywhere. So, on one hand, I think the onus is on them to defend why we should even keep this thing called America, because to me, it seems like it's a train wreck. But what are some of the, what's some of the opposition you hear, the most common ones?
Well, once again, there's been progress here. When I'm also a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. When I first joined the group about 15 years ago, even in that group, former, you might call them neo-Confederates. I wouldn't call them that, but in any case, you can call them that if you like. But even among that group, they backed away when they heard the word secession. But now, this, according to polling that was cited last night by Daniel Miller of the TNM, polling consistently shows that 60% of Texans, at least 60%, want out. So that's why every time that TNM backed propositions to get a referendum placed before the public is consistently bottled up in committee. They don't want it out because they know that once it's out there, just as a what would you call it? Essentially a polling referendum asking, would you consider us, the Texas state government, making preparations of some kind for a possible secession, or would you favor secession in any way? These 60% don't get a voice, but if they were to have a voice just for that referendum, then an explosion of questions and discussion about how that's done.
Yeah.
And in some ways it's a simple matter, but in other ways, I mentioned the complicated ways and the complicated considerations in the book, but essentially it's that if a state wants to go its own way, and if it doesn't do something provocative, like, for example, seize federal property within the state, who's going to stop them? Here's a very surprising statistic that was cited again last night, and that is that, okay, who's going to go in and put us down? He said that 1 out of every 6 active duty service members in the United States military is a Texan. Is that astonishing?
Yeah.
You think you're going to have Texans shooting down Texans? I don't think so. So when push comes to shove, if it does, touch wood that it doesn't, come to violence and there's no need for it, I think the government would embarrass itself. It would be, as Mr. Miller said last night, a temporary time of suffering for Texans and a permanent failure, a complete collapse on the national scale.
And I wish I had the book in front of me, because you mentioned, federal lands, so to speak, within states. You have a whole section that you talk about all of the things, waterways and forts and, all sorts of stuff, that the nooks and crannies of, okay, this guy's talking philosophy, but he's also talking exactly what would happen, at least from the Texas perspective. And that right there, I don't think, I've read a lot of secession stuff, and I haven't read anybody that talks technically as thoroughly about that kind of stuff. This is what we're going to do, and this is a path forward that could be, like you said, a temporary time of suffering, but you can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. I wish I had the book in front of me. Can you give some of the topics you cover,
Yes.
just from your table of contents or from your memory? I was going to hold up the table of contents, but again, I don't have the book here with me. Sorry.
That's the problem. So yeah, you raise a point of contention that I have with libertarians, and that is they believe in spontaneous markets, according to Hayek and the Austrians, which is fine for economics. But on this question, they refuse to think. They say that things will emerge spontaneously. We'll have anarchy, and everybody will contractually agree that that police run by insurance agencies will be just the thing. Well, maybe not. So have you thought about it? Have you pictured anything? The closest thing that comes to an actual depiction of what happens in a what do we call it, non-state institution was given by David Friedman a long time ago in his book, The Machinery of Freedom. He studied the Icelandic government, but really everybody shies away from that topic. But you have to meet these head on, and there are many common complaints raised that are easily put down. For example, among the older set, they say, well, what's going to happen to my Social Security? Yeah. And so who's going to pay my Social Security? And first of all, if your retirement years depend on that piddling thing, you're already in a bad way. But there is already in place equalization agreements between the United States government and other governments. Say, for example, you were born in Spain and you worked 10 years in Spain, and then you became an American citizen and worked another 20 years. Well, the retirement systems in both cases, there's a schedule of equalization so that you get a payment from both governments. And that's already in place. So you're not going to lose that. And another question that comes up all the time, and here I think I hammer this one completely into the ground. This is just a silly topic that it just easily crushed, and that is, the question is, what do we do with the national debt? Oh, dear Lord, we got to pay some of that national debt. Some of it's on us. Well, according to the United Nations and other government, super government juridical bodies, there's this concept of odious debt. Odious debt means that if a debt is burdensome in a way, deliberately burdensome to the seceding state, it's invalid. And also, too, say that we have an agreement that we agree to repay some part of the debt. Well, that debt is not owing to the United States government. It's owing to the bondholders. The United States, their eyes grow big and they think we've got a bonanza. We got Texas on the hook. We're going to get the money. No, it doesn't go to you. It goes to the bondholders. So that would, and also the payoff to the bondholders would have to be contingent on the following consideration: on the national government undertaking a policy of repayment to the debt holder. Is that going to take place? No, it's not. There will never be a retirement of the national debt. So why should Texas be burdened with retiring some part of it? And so finally, I think, clincher argument is that we could sit down and say, not only will we take 15% of the national debt, we'll take the whole thing, bring it on. And then we repudiate every last penny of it. So what? So they say, oh, well, you won't be able to borrow then. Oh no, nobody on the national scene on the international scene will loan you any money. That is a complete lie. You look at the cases. Oh my God, southern hemisphere is awash with governments that have repeatedly, worst of all is Argentina. They've repudiated their debt at least 4 times, and they still get money. So when you look at all of the benefits and the economic richness of Texas, and you say, well, how do we compare with Argentina? Well, we're going to get the money. So, and we don't need the United States to loan us the money.
Right.
Yeah. So in other words, there are no standing arguments against secession. Of course, there's the simplistic one of being a traitor. Of course, being convicted of traitor means an overt act by more than one person for something that gives aid and comfort to the enemy. Well, there's no third party enemy that we're giving aid and comfort to. Secession is not the same thing as a tyrannical act. So all of those arguments are completely gone.
Give me one more example from the end part of your book, some of the common complaints. What about a standing army or defense?
Oh, good one. The TNM, Texas Nationalist Movement, want some kind of military presence. I say it's a completely bad idea. I say that every county should train intensively in asymmetrical warfare. In no case should Texas field a battlefield army, because its defeat would mean the defeat of the entire state. With asymmetrical, essentially guerrilla resistance, anybody who invades the state of Texas is going to say, as I quote in my book, a rifle behind every blade of grass. It won't happen. So if Texas are resolved to be independent, they've got to train themselves, much like Israel and in Switzerland, in self-defense. So there are, in fact, I'm studying other community defense ideas, not just that one, but essentially it's got to be something that quite apart from something that West Point already knows about.
Right. Now, you're talking to me, you've written a book. You obviously think communicating these ideas and education is the way to reach people. You also make the point in the book that Americans typically don't mind being part of the herd, that oftentimes they are followers. So tell us how we can get your book out there, how, besides people who are listening to this, buying it and reading it, but what are the best ways to communicate the ideas from your book that we think are palatable and doable to kind of pushing the ball down the field, secession-wise,
Right.
essentialist wise.
Yeah. Well, Texas has an enormous head start. When the Brexit discussion began in the UK, the initial polling showed only 40% of the people in favor. As I just mentioned, 60% of Texans are in favor. So that puts us way ahead of the essential thing in secession. That is, secession is a peaceful resolution of intractable differences between groups of people. It's the only peaceful solution to intractable differences, in my opinion. And to remain so, to remain peaceful, it must be a program of education, as you just suggested. So I would say, to answer your question, that once this essentially secession referendum appears on the next state ballot, and it won't cost a penny because it would appear with other referenda, then you could step from there by asking, say, for example, and this is what I would propose, to have the state legislature create a standing committee for discussion of these thorny problems, some of which I discussed. There are many others, and I hope I can get to them in the second edition of my book. But just have a standing committee that says, no, we're not seceding. We're simply studying what we might do if it is forced upon us, for example, by the collapse of the empire. That would be one thing. And another thing that would be easily done is to have some angel, some financial angel, put up even something as common as billboards, or have local discussion groups, or have speakers go into Kiwanis meetings, or church groups. In fact, that's where this last night's discussion took place, inside a church. And these are a few of the ways. There, once the dam breaks, either with the collapse of the empire or with the publication of a referendum at the state level, the whole process just takes a momentum of its own. And there are many ways that probably people more adept in communication can devise than I can.
I love the idea of a standing committee at your state level. Would you say, would you want those even at smaller levels too, local, county as well? Or do you think it would be most useful of time to go to the state capitol?
Well, interestingly, I bought at cost 254 copies of my book, and guess where they're going? 254 counties, remember?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, that's right.
So
Smart.
every single book, every single county commission is going to get a copy of the book. And also there's going to be a backup forwarding envelope inside saying that, if you're just dead set against secession, put the book into the envelope and send it to the second person. And that second person will be,
that's hilarious.
Yeah, that second person will be their nearest, their closest in proximity professor of political science.
That's smart.
So, yeah, well, first, as I say, I'm first hitting the practical people.
Right.
And then if they boot it, they'll boot it to the political scientists. But I'm in awe of the county commissioners. They make the state go. Right. They are the ones who are burdened with implementing most of the laws that are cooked up in Austin. In fact, that's one of their complaints. They say, okay, well, you've legislated this. Where's the money for it? And they're often burdened with unfunded mandates.
Right. Well, I think that's a really interesting way to go about it, to have these standing committees, because this is something, like you said, secession talk was a huge no-no even back in 2018. I often say this on my podcast when I'm talking about secession. I went to a secession conference, and when I told the normal people I know that I'd been to a secession conference, they already thought I was weird, but they just thought I was nuts. And now it's just like an everyday word. So I think it's going to, when it happens, the inevitable collapse or this referendum, I mean, it's going to be a watershed thing. I think it's going to be like dominoes. So it's better for us to not only just talk about these, but have some action as well. And then you end your book with a history of secession in all 50 states. That right there is worth the price of the book too. It's just a few pages long, but it talks about exactly that and how secession is an extremely American thing. And
Yes.
so you're not pushing some kind of wild-eyed thing that you just made up. It's part of our history. So I thought that was a really clever way to end the book too, just to familiarize people with their own history, that we are all born of this thing called secession. So
Yes, indeed.
get used to it.
Yeah. If secession is wrong, then we need to give ourselves back to Great Britain, right?
Exactly. Well, sir, it has been about 2 hours. I could talk so much, so we could go off on so many more tangents, but I think we did a good job of the philosophy and the practicality of it. And I really appreciate you coming on. And I think your book is awesome. And I'm going to buy a few copies of my own and definitely pass my copy on to somebody as well. So thank you, Terry.
Okay, here we can have another picture.
Yes, and it's available through Shotwell Publishing and Amazon. I will put those links in the show notes. Is there any other link you want in the show notes?
Oh, actually, you can compare prices. It's also in the Mises bookstore.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Very cool. Very cool. And Terry also sells other books, like I had said in the intro, but I recently bought for my son, whose 16th birthday is coming up, the 25 Texas Heroes. I haven't received it yet, but I'm really excited about that because my husband is a native Texan, so we have
Oh,
a strong affinity for thinking Texas is pretty awesome.
I suggest that you tell him to begin with the vignette on Buddy Holly. I'm most proud of
Okay.
that.
Oh,
But
very cool. Okay. Yeah, and my son, all three of them are, but the one who's turning 16, he is a musician. They're pianists, so he will like that as well. Well, thank you, Terry. It has been a pleasure. God bless you and all that you do. I hope the book sells like hotcakes after this big interview, and I really appreciate it.
oh, thank you, Rebecca. You're a wonder.
Thanks, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye.